Hello Canada, welcome back to another edition of the Canadian Citizen Journal. I'm your host, alias to Guy. Well, we just had a damning report come out from the PBO. Canada is, well, we're bankrupt, people. Now, he doesn't much come out and say that we're bankrupt, but he's sure trying to get the point across that there are no fiscal guardrails. The last 10 years has been a complete catastrophe, and the government has already blown, and well, they've cranked up Canada onto the catapult and are getting ready to pop the pin and launch us into, well, a point of no return. Now, Canada's been in trouble for a long time, and it all really stemmed from the beginning of when socialism took its grasp of Canada, which was through Pierre Trudeau, the big turd. He set in motion a pile of different things that for some reason out east, well, I shouldn't say for some reason, I know why there are some people out east that still think that Pierre was some savior to Canada, although he was, without a shadow of a doubt, the worst thing that ever happened to our nation. We have suffered and still suffer from every single thing that piece of crap socialist did. And I'm going to prove to you on the channel how he did exactly and taught his son exactly on how to try and finish Canada off. And of course, I got all the documents to prove it. I'm going to show you documents that I've never seen anybody else show. But hours of research, hours of digging have allowed me to build up terabytes of information. Now, we're already seeing that Carney is the exact same as Trudeau. There is no difference. And it's all given proof on what he's trying to do by trying to finish off the last stanchion, the last battle that was won by the provinces when they created the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was to put in the notwithstanding clause. Now, you got to remember, this Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a lot of people out there, they always say, oh, that goes against the Charter of Rights and Freedom. It was not written for the people. If you look over the fine print, you will see it is a bullcrap document pushed by propaganda to try to convince people that it was like some sort of an American Constitution for the rights of Canadians. That is so far from the truth. Like, it is so far from the truth. It is light years away from the truth. He wanted to ensure the federal government had complete control of all of Canada. And the premiers fought back and had that notwithstanding clause put in. Now, you add that to Trudeau ensuring to buy off the media and appoint, and we've allowed this to happen. Media is a little bit behind. That's why I always urge everybody to like, share, and subscribe. Propaganda to brainwash people that kept them in power long enough that not only has he pretty much taken the entire Supreme Court over by liberal leftists, which will do anything to protect their ideology, which I'm going to prove again. I always got the documents, just the facts. Sorry, just the truth, just the facts. But has also allowed him to blow all of the efforts done in the 30 years of trying to fix the debt and problems that his father created. Now, we're going to dive right into this PBO report, and I'm warning you people, you may want to have some Pepto-Bismol. And as for the people out west, this, and I'm sure Quebec right now is thinking the exact same thing, should be the final straw on why we need to get out. I'm going to dabble on to the necessary steps. Well, first of all, what really created this problem and what we need to do to get it back. And that is the Bank of Canada. Now, if Alberta and Saskatchewan leave, They can create their own bank, call their country whatever they want, blah, 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 the bank of blah, blah, blah. But I'm going to explain to you with documents showing you what was ripped from the people, from Pierre, and then once again used against us by his son, and now is being profited by Carney on you. Let's get started.
Of your report, you no longer predict the debt to GDP ratio improving. In fact, it would appear that what was once a fiscal anchor has now been abandoned by this Prime Minister and his government, as your report indicates the debt to GDP increasing to a clearly alarming rate of 42.5%. So my questions are these. Is this sustainable? At what point does it hit a critical point? And should Canadians be concerned?
Can I jump in?
Yes.
Still working out the kinks. Thank you for your question. To answer, I think, the most important part of the question first, I think everybody should be concerned. My jokes aside, it's a really serious day, right? This is the first time in 30 years that we've tabled an economic and fiscal outlook where the fiscal anchor of the general and probably most important fiscal anchor for any government is a declining or at least stable debt to GDP ratio. And this is the first time in 30 years that I've seen one in which that ratio is going up over time. So that's definitely a cause for concern. Certainly on our end, we're hoping and certainly expecting the government, as part of Budget 2025, to clearly indicate what the government plans to do to address this and potentially address this problem, because it's certainly not sustainable.
Thank you. In response to your last statement, again, under the current leadership, this government is set to worsen the outlook of our debt. Have you had any indication that it is going to change course?
The government has indicated that they're planning on tabling a budget on November 4th. I think certainly looking at the public statements of the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, these numbers probably, I don't think they come as a surprise to them. Some of the language that the Prime Minister has certainly used has been very strong with respect to the economic and fiscal challenges that are facing the country right now. And again, we look forward to seeing the government's plan to manage or address the challenges that Canada faces. As the Parliamentary Budget Office, and as we discussed last week, our job is to set the table for parliamentarians, to present numbers to them. So as parliamentarians, you're well prepared to engage in thoughtful and meaningful discussion regarding how this projection hopefully will not come to pass.
Thank you. In your opening statements, you spoke to the fact that this outlook does not include incremental measures to achieve the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or in other words, our commitments to NATO. And I'm wondering if you would be able to comment on what other spending that may have been included in the Liberal platform is not included in your numbers.
Thank you for your question. The last time that I've looked, there's about 20 billion or so in spending that has not yet been included in our outlook from the Liberal platforms, if it does come to pass. So we will see on November 4th what they will announce and what they don't announce, but roughly that is what's not included in our outlook right now.
Thank you. So last week we talked about the government looking to change the rules for accounting and splitting out capital and operating, and how they may choose to define those things. And I can't find a rationale from the government on why they would overturn a long history of accounting practice with the budget. Can you explain why the Liberals are separating the capital and operating budgets? And why can't they demonstrate progress in the economy without making these changes?
I would note that the government up to this point has indicated that they're planning on maintaining the existing presentation of data, so the traditional measures of debt and deficit that you see in the public accounts that everyone is used to, in addition to presenting this new framework of splitting the operating and capital budgets, or like day-to-day spending plus some sort of investment. It's an approach that happens in other jurisdictions. To the best of my knowledge, pretty much every Canadian province has an operating budget, a standard budget, plus an investment budget. As we discussed last week, the City of Toronto does the same thing. To the extent that it can be additive and helps parliamentarians understand that potentially more money needs to be borrowed over the short term in order to make investments to transition to longer term sustainable economic growth, potentially at a higher level, that it could potentially be useful. Going back to the point
Sorry,
that
I have to cut you off there. We're past our time, but perhaps we're going to get back to it next round.
What is worrying, is it most worrying, is it the increase in the debt to GDP ratio or the lack of a specific budget plan?
pour moi, je pense que
In my view, it's the increase in the debt to GDP ratio. On November 4th, there will be a plan, according to the Government of Canada. But in all honesty, it was clear even before we published our figures that there's a tremendous challenge in Canada, but seeing the figures and the increase in the debt as a percentage of our economy, that was quite stupefying. So now we have a snapshot of how things stand now. The Prime Minister was sold to us as an international banker, but do you believe that he is being sufficiently serious about the economic and budgetary situation? I'm not a psychologist. As an interim parliamentary budget officer, I'm not well placed to talk about the psychological state of the Prime Minister of Canada. The deficit includes new spending that was in the Liberal Party's campaign. Your projection does not include those. No. What if we were to include them? I'm thinking about the defense budget and the promised increase to NATO's 5%. So what will the debt to GDP ratio be then? I don't think we calculated that, but we might be able to prepare some figures and provide them to the committee within a few days. What I'm seeing is that spending is going up, and the federal budget's trajectory is concerning. If we were to look at an analogy, it's like a family seeing its income go down, but that family isn't adjusting its spending accordingly. Yes, that's a good analogy, I believe. We're waiting to see the budget on November 4th. So if we look at the next decade, if public finances were not restructured, if there was no plan for that, what would the consequences be for Canada? Well, I think we have used the word significant, major in our report. Not enviable in the long term, not sustainable in the long term. That's what's shocking. And this is why we are waiting to see with interest what Canada will do to rectify that projection. Well, the IMF talks about 3 very clear budget rules. The first is that a budget should be clear, should be simple, and should not be manipulated by the government. In those 3, what we can call rules, what would Canada's score be, or grade? What grade would you give Canada on that? I couldn't really say because, well, last week the Prime Minister did provide some clarification on some of Canada's financial and budget issues. Last week did show some progress, but things are not yet clear. I'd give it a C at the moment. I'd give it a grade of C. But you know, it's like for my children, it's a C for now, but there will be chances to bring that grade up in the coming weeks and months. For my next question.
He does a very good job in trying to be apolitical. He's not coming out here, it's the end of the world, although he is stating it's the end of Canada. We're if we follow through with what this budget is looking like, it is the beginning of our demise. We are already in huge trouble. But we have time to correct. The reason the government, now this is my opinion, but the reason the government has been in hiding all summer during this supposed existential threat is because they're cooking the books. This is what they've been doing. They have so much corruption. Carney himself is making millions of dollars right now, people. Already, just off the few decisions that he said he's pushing through and we're going to build this and he's invested in them. He's invested in them. This is the most conflicted Prime Minister in the entirety of Canada's history. It doesn't even touch our very first Prime Ministers, who a few of them were kind of invested in the rail and this guy, the money he's made already puts all of that to shame.
Question. I'd like to know what the medium-term consequences on taxpayers might be, given how things stand. I'll come back to this. My time is up. Thank you. See, I'm keeping to my time. 25 seconds, right. So what would those repercussions be? Clearly, revenue will have to go up, and perhaps at the same time, spending will have to go down. The current numbers aren't sustainable. And I imagine that people at the Department of Finance are well aware of that. So I believe the November 4th budget will show that changes are to come. Thank you. Thank you.
Now, this has been the plot of Liberals. This is what they do. So Liberals come in power for the most part. Now, there have been a few good Liberals out there, but for the most part, they buy their way into power. They spend to the point where they got to start hiking taxes. They do everything they can to deceive the people and tax the living bejesus out of them, but not enough to fix the damages that their programs are costing. And then finally, a conservative government will get in there, and in order to do the right thing, they have to hurt Canadians. they have to slap Canada with the frozen fish and say, hey, in order to pay this down, we need revenue. The Liberals have broke us. We're going to try and fix this. And we never seem to give them enough time. And then out they get voted because, well, they try everything possible to take down the debt. And the little bit of good that they do gets overshadowed by more spending money, Liberal promises, more debt, more taxes. This is the circle of death to Canada that's been going on for far too long. This is where the West, and most people are talking about this right now. Even before this PBO came out, we are already talking about the debt, because we're seeing, and everybody knows, that before the Parliamentary Budget Officer even came out and stated how bad it was, there were already a lot of different hypotheses flying on estimates that he had already broke the budget of what the turd was going to spend. And the West knows we can't keep repeating this. Even if the Conservatives win, they're going to get ousted again, and we're going to repeat the same thing over and over again. How far are we going to allow the government to tax us to death? You don't own your home. Nobody in Canada owns their home. It's not like it was pre-1930s where you owned your home. No, don't pay your taxes for a couple years and see if you own your home. We've allowed the governments, and this, again, it's not just Liberals, Conservatives have done it as well. We've had both of them, because we don't have proper, well, we're ruled by the king. We are a commonwealth following their parliamentary system, a system that is, well, never worked proper. Every time somebody comes along through history to try to correct it, from the Magna Carta all the way through, that ends up being just hidden and forgotten, and the people get abused. And the only way to change that, is to start with a fresh constitution, to start from scratch. And yes, get off the bankers and start a bank for the country, like we had before the turd senior destroyed it and took all of our wealth and gave it to the banking machine.
The public debt charges is $53.6 billion, and that projection is going to increase in 2030 to $82.4 billion.
Shit.
Is that sustainable?
We also see that the debt servicing ratio is increasing over the projection horizon. So every dollar spent on debt is a dollar that is not spent elsewhere. As Mr. Jake said, that the debt to GDP ratio is something that we look at in terms of sustainability. So that is what we're tracking, and that is what we're very focused on.
Yeah, and I mean, that was one of the hallmark fiscal anchors of the Trudeau government, right? And when it was 30.8, it was never going to go higher than that. That was kind of their commitment, and here we are in the table here. It's 41.7, increasing to 43.7. Again, how alarming is that for the average Canadian, for the taxpayer? Because there is only one taxpayer, right?
Sorry. I'll hazard a response. It should be very alarming, right? These are, I don't know, I think I used the words in French, and which the translators probably got really well, like stupefying, shocking, right? This is not, like, it's not a funny fiscal outlook. It's a really serious fiscal outlook. And we don't lightly use the word unsustainable, right? Unsustainable means you don't have the option of saying, maybe I'll wait a couple of years, I'll see how things go. It means if you don't change, this is done, right? So it's very serious. And I think, as anyone who's managed a household budget knows, if you sit down at the end of the month and you don't have enough money to pay your bills, and it happens month after month after month, you know that something's going to break.
Kind of along that, you look at the federal debt number in that table number 2, 24-25, it's $1,281 billion, and in 2030 it's up to $1,655 billion. What impact does that have on the Canadian economy and for businesses, for taxpayers, for the people who are supposed to be the ones generating the wealth? When we see the government is in debt $1,655 billion in the year 2030, what impact does that have?
Well, currently the economy that's definitely a big, I guess, one of the big drivers of what's currently happening in the economy, but there's also heightened uncertainty related to trade policies. But if we look at the federal government debt, maybe Christina will be a bit more better place to elaborate, but I would have to say that something to keep in mind is that a great portion of the federal debt is domestically emitted, so it is Canadian banks receiving profit from that debt, and there are various levels or various participants of the financial markets who are involved in that debt market. So it's not necessarily foreign actors who are holding that debt, but it's just important to keep in mind that some domestic actors are also benefiting from that.
Now, I'm going to read you something very, very important that a lot of Canadians are misinformed and just outright lied to about. And this was the goal, and is the goal of, well, socialist, but especially, and I'm using the word fascist governments, is to take all of the wealth of the nation away from the people. Because if you can control the monetary system, if you can take away its wealth, you create dependency upon the government, which is what they want. This is a great article. Again, I post everything down below. Such as it is, few Canadians are aware of the history of our nation's economic transition away from the Bank of Canada and towards the international banking, or what is referred to as charter banking. As it happens, as recent as the year 2011, a lawsuit was filed in the federal court by the Committee on Monetary and Economic Reform against the Government of Canada and the Bank of Canada. The lawsuit attempted to restore the use of the Bank of Canada to its original purpose by exercising its public statutory duty and responsibility. That purpose included making interest-free loans to the municipal, provincial, and federal governments for human capital expenditures, i.e. education, health, and other social services, and or infrastructure expenditures. After nearly 5.5 years of contentious litigation, on May 4th, 2017, notice the year, who secured a majority? The great Trudeau's son. The Supreme Court of Canada made a decision not to hear the case because the next appointed judges were all Liberals. They had secured their power in stopping this, any litigation, any type of court proceedings from going on, any type of ability for Canadians to be aware of the damage that Pierre had done to Canada. The Bank of Canada was first created in 1934 under private ownership. Then in 1938, the government nationalized the bank. Since this time, it has been publicly owned. It was mandated to lend not only to the federal government, but to the provinces as well, and was injected into various infrastructure projects. With the outbreak of the Second World War, it was the Bank of Canada that financed the war effort. For the following 30 years, the Bank of Canada helped to transform Canada's economy while elevating the standard of living for Canadians. We were a superpower. Yes, we are a large nation, but our population was absolutely minuscule compared to those who we stood shoulder to shoulder with in the creation of some great organizations like the UN, like NATO, like all of these different. We were a powerhouse because of our bank. The critical point here is that between 1939 and 1974, the federal government borrowed extensively from its own central bank. The result was what was best for Canadian society: interest-free debt. It was at this point in the situation was fundamentally altered. An entity called the Basel Committee was created to ostensibly establish global monetary and financial stability. As it happened, Liberal Prime Minister Pierre Turd became involved in the process. An ominous sign indeed. The Basel Committee's recommendation was to encourage the Liberal government to borrow from interest-charging private banks and end the practice of borrowing interest-free from their own publicly owned banks. This was sold to Canadians as a good thing by propaganda. Now, this is a huge document that I urge you to scroll through. The information in here is the Turd Sr. did what his son did. From 1968 to 1984, he paid and increased the amount of funds the government was giving to the CBC. He not only jumped in bed with them, he pretty much ruled what Canada could hear and see. You can see the funding clear as day when the Liberals came into power. And it took right off. And you could see where he kind of got unelected and lost. Had a minority government. Didn't lose, but had a minority government. And then came back into power trying to buy propaganda. But it was too late. Because a lot of Canadians realized, holy shit, this is one evil man. And again, the East swayed a minority conservative government, and those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. Now, back to this. So the Basel's Committee recommendation was to encourage the Liberal government to borrow from interest-charging private banks and end the practice of borrowing interest-free from their publicly owned banks. How do you convince a population that this is a good thing? Well, I just showed you how. Propaganda. They started Trudeau-mania. It never existed. When he came out west, nobody liked him, nobody wanted him. But the media, the propaganda was pumping up this fictitious Trudeau-mania. Where did we see that again? Right, just like they did with his son. Propaganda people. The difference is simply that a publicly owned bank returns the interest to the government and the community, while a privately owned bank siphons the interest into its capital account to be reinvested at further interest, progressively drawing money out of a productive economy. Why did Pierre Trudeau endorse this transition? Was the endorsement to the benefit of the Canadian economy, citizens, families, workers, or any other element of society? It appears not. In typical Liberal fashion, all the benefits appear to go to non-Canadian international sources. What in 2020 may be labeled as the globalists, which you hear me say so often. The global cabal. Now, they've listed all the nice debt increases here. According to the Canadian Dimension report, the decision was never debated by Parliament, nor was it questioned by opposition parties. A failure on everybody's account. Why? Bad media. Notice a lack of democratic process. See how neatly this fits in with the anti-democratic nature of Pierre Trudeau's communist enthusiast? To what extent did establishment media dissect this axiomatic transformation? You got it. The answer is zero. Zilch. Nada. As a result, Canadians have been saddled with government debt at all levels, debt that has risen exponentially since the 1970s. Over a 108-year period from 1867 to 1974, the accumulated debt shows as nearly a flat line, growing to only $18 billion. But around 1974, the debt began to grow exponentially, and over a mere 43 years, it reached $728 billion in 2017. Canadian Prime Minister in 2017? Justin Trudeau. The debt curve that began its exponential rise in 1974 tilted toward the vertical in 1981 when interest rates were raised by the U.S. Federal Reserve at 20%. The same process that happened to Canada happened to the States. Roosevelt said it was the worst decision of his life, and he pretty much was going to burn in hell for what he had done to his nation. So who was Prime Minister in 1980-1984? Well, Pierre Trudeau. Canada has now forked out over $1 trillion in deficit interest payments. Now fast forward to 2015, the year son Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister of Canada. The fact that Trudeau Jr. put national deficit as well as personal and family debt into the stratosphere is irrefutable. Does media hide the disservice of Justin Trudeau in 2020 as they did for Pierre in 1974? Of course they do. All my viewers do. And hopefully you enjoy my channel. Like, share, and subscribe, because you'll understand this too. Something's fishy is going on with the former Great White North. Of course there is. And of course there has never, ever since the day Pierre Trudeau seized control of Canada in the year of 1968. Anyone heard of the combined long-term government media obfuscation? A planned and premeditated seduction of society for the benefit of non-Canadians, international banks, and globalist power players? Well, now you have. Too bad 98% of society will never experience a similar feeling due to the pseudo-communist Trudeau family and their mainstream media backers. This is an amazing article. Now, let's get back at it.
Mr. Chair, and thank you everybody for being here today. I do think it's important to take a look at Table 2 here, and for people back home, as of 2024-25, the public debt charges is $53.6 billion, and that projection is going to increase in 2030 to $82.4 billion. Is that sustainable?
We also see that the debt servicing ratio is increasing over the projection horizon. So every dollar spent on debt is a dollar that is not spent elsewhere. As Mr. Jake said, that the debt to GDP ratio is something that we look at in terms of sustainability. So that is what we're tracking, and that is what we're very focused on.
Yeah, and I mean, that was one of the hallmark fiscal anchors of the Trudeau government, right? And when it was 30.8, it was never going to go higher than that. That was kind of their commitment. And here we are in the table here, it's 41.7, increasing to 43.7. Again, how alarming is that for the average Canadian, for the taxpayer? Because there is only one taxpayer, right?
Sorry. I'll hazard a response. It should be very alarming, right? These are, I don't know, I think I use the words in French, and which the translators probably got really well, like stupefying, shocking, right? This is not, like, it's not a funny fiscal outlook. It's a really serious fiscal outlook. And we don't lightly use the word unsustainable, right? Unsustainable means you don't have the option of saying, maybe I'll wait a couple of years, I'll see how things go. It means if you don't change, this is done, right? So it's very serious. And I think, as anyone who's managed a household budget knows, if you sit down at the end of the month and you don't have enough money to pay your bills, and it happens month after month after month, you know that something's going to break.
Kind of along that, you look at the federal debt number in that table number 2, 24-25, it's $1,281 billion, and in 2030 it's up to $1,655 billion. What impact does that have on the Canadian economy and for businesses, for taxpayers, for the people who are supposed to be the ones generating the wealth? But when we see the government is in debt $1,655 billion in the year 2030, what impact does that have?
Well, currently the economy is, that's definitely a big, I guess, one of the big drivers of what's currently happening in the economy, but there's also heightened uncertainty related to trade policies. But if we look at the federal government debt, maybe Christina will be a bit more better place to elaborate, but I would have to say that something to keep in mind is that a great portion of the federal debt is domestically emitted, so it is Canadian banks receiving profit from that debt, and there are various levels or various participants of the financial markets who are involved in that debt market. So it's not necessarily foreign actors who are holding that debt, but it's just important to keep in mind that some domestic actors are also benefiting from that.
Some.
Right. So when we look at what happened with tariffs, for example, the Prime Minister said he's going to collect $20 billion in tariffs. And in your report, it says there's only $8 billion. This morning, CBC wrote an article that the Prime Minister quietly removed even more tariffs than what he initially said. So again, we're over $12 billion. There's a $12 billion shortfall here. And we don't really see a path forward in that situation. What impact is that going to have for Canadians?
In terms of the amounts that the government is collecting from the countermeasures, the government has also announced as many measures as we have assumed that it collected. So as you've mentioned in our report, we've noted that it could collect $8 billion in the 3-year span, but it has also announced a lot of support measures to other industries.
I have to cut you off there because it's past our time.
I had to clip out, and also to save time in the video, but it's all verbal diarrhea. But there are certain moments where liberals open their mouths, and every time they are trying to they're trying to get video clips and sound bites that they can give to the media, the propaganda, to keep brainwashing the people that we're okay. We've got a banker now. Everything's going to be okay. When that's the furthest thing from the truth, the furthest thing from reality that's actually happening. And every time they've come out, they've already achieved a few little video clips just because this PBO has not taken sides. He's forced to answer questions that can and will be used against him in the propaganda forum. But for the most part, they get shut down like this.
Another question, obviously. You project, so we're on a good fiscal path, or we're on a better fiscal path than some of our G7 colleagues, and you project our deficit staying under 2% of GDP and debt holding near the low 40% range. Would you agree that these kinds of thresholds are really in practice fiscal anchors that signal some discipline.
I would go back to one of the comments I made at the outset that, like, the most important word in the release this morning was unsustainable. We like it. I don't know. We didn't. We didn't choose it carelessly. I've been in the office for 17 years. I was working in the federal government, putting together budgets for 10 years prior to that. You got to be like, you choose these words of prudence and care. And certainly we don't want to be alarmist. And at the same time, like the current path we're on in terms of federal debt as a share of the economy is unsustainable.
Yep, thank you. Coming back to our credit rating. Obviously.
Now, we have to understand, and this is what the banking institutions did. This is one of the deceitful practices that they have, that they use to convince the masses that spending is a good thing. We have a AAA credit rating because we're borrowing money and paying it back, so we've got good credit. What happens if a country has zero debt? Well, then it's got a zero credit rating. Well, we don't know if they're very good or reliable. So it's not good for you to have a surplus of your own money. They don't want you buying a vehicle with cash. They want you to borrow money and pay the interest. Then you have their loud vocal propaganda machines saying, look at how good this person is. This person is trustworthy because he can pay for this vehicle. Well, if I didn't have to use the bank and I could pay it for cash and save all of that interest money and put that interest money towards, I don't know, my kids, my house, other debt, that right there exposes the lie of what a AAA rating is. And this AAA gets used against these nations all the time because it's a global propaganda where all of a sudden now, if you're failing into your debt, it's pretty much a flare up in the skies for all of the other nations to get their crap together, pay more money, borrow more money, use more money, tax your citizens more for the wealthy. This is just the banking. There's a reason that religions around the world have documented, and the Bible's a great one, Dead Sea Scrolls, original documents, you can go right back all the way, on how Jesus felt towards the bankers, because he understood how evil it really was. It can be used as a good thing, like the Bank of Canada once was. But they've taken it. They've ripped it from the people for profit. And this is where the buzzards like Carney reap profits off of taxpayers, off of the hardships of people, like what his company has done down in Brazil and other third world countries. Again, no mainstream media talking about it. If you're new to the channel, I urge you, watch previous episodes. I expose all of it. Well, there's still more to expose. I expose a lot of it.
Obviously, it's a fairly internationally recognized standard in terms of how sustainable our fiscal position is. How does that compare to some of our G7 colleagues?
We, relatively speaking, again, similar to the fiscal metrics, we end up being further ahead or closer to the top of the group.
Thank you.
Right.
There's their soundbite.
Before we go to Mr. Gill, just to follow up on Mr.
There's their video clip. They got it. Are you aware of the debt the other nations have incurred? They're all in trouble, people. This is a forced depression pushed upon us by the banking institutions and the global elite to rake in more power more profits, take away more resources, take away more home ownerships, more land ownerships, proprietorships of everything you can possibly imagine. This is the cycle that we keep going down. We keep forgetting the past and allowing this to happen. Propaganda is the enemy. This is why it happens. Because the masses have no idea. They're force-fed bullcrap. 24 hours a day.
Our debt servicing at currently, I think, I saw the figure, it's $55 billion for the whole year, so it's $1 billion a week roughly. Projected to go up to, I think, $82 billion by 2029-30. At what point would the interest costs start forcing cuts to healthcare, education, and other services? Because the growth rate is not going to be the same as the debt ratio is going, or are we expecting the GST revenues to be matching that growth?
Yeah, I'd say sorry, excuse me. I'd say in terms of the increase in the debt charge expenses, yet more broadly, and as I mentioned earlier, the path we're currently on isn't sustainable, and the government will need to make choices to either increase revenues or cut spending in order to arrest this unsustainable path that we're on. I don't know. We don't put together the budget. We only analyze the budget and put together forecasts. So I don't know precisely what's on the table at this point, beyond what the government's already announced publicly.
So the increase in revenue is possibly through taxes then? Increase in taxes?
Generically. So in a situation where you need to reduce your budget deficit, you need to be able to bring in, on a net basis, more revenue. So you reduce your deficit in order to return to a fiscally sustainable path. You need to either increase your revenues, so more cash coming in, or decrease the amount of money that you're spending, or a combination of both.
How much more time do I have, sir? In your previous appearance before this committee, you said that you weren't aware if the government had any fiscal anchors. In your report, you outlined that the Liberals have abandoned their two previous fiscal anchors, namely that they will no longer have a declined debt-to-GDP ratio, and their budgetary deficits will exceed 1% of GDP. What impact will this have on future government spending if they continue to operate without fiscal anchors?
Last week, the Prime Minister was asked in question period to clarify the fiscal anchors. He did provide some clarification indicating that there's going to be a greater shift to investment, declining level of debt overall. So there does provide some clarity that there are fiscal anchors. I believe the Minister of Finance also provided guidance regarding a target regarding a deficit, a budgetary deficit as a share of GDP anchor. That said, it certainly isn't comprehensive at this point with respect to what they are. It's always helpful to have fiscal anchors, right? It's always useful. It's the reason why hopefully you don't need guardrails while you're driving down the highway.
Got to cut you off there, I'm afraid.
Rapidement, Monsieur le Président.
Quickly, Chair. I'm neither an economist nor an accountant. But if we want income and expenditure to balance, well, personally, in my view, if I look at what's going on here, I would have been bankrupt a long time ago. So how can the government, explain this. How can the government base its taxes and reduce the government's tax base? What am I failing to understand here? We are not really well placed to explain the Canadian government's policy decisions. I'm the interim parliamentary budget officer. I don't comment on policy. But I can ask you whether this is responsible. With reduction in tax revenue and increased spending, that will increase the deficit. And exacerbate the problem that the Government of Canada needs to rectify. There's another issue here. We see that there'll be a reduction in the size of the public service. That's been promised for some time now. But that actually is associated with a 20% increase in the country, because there'll be a 5% increase in defense spending, or spending will go up to 5% of GDP. Well, there'll be more detail on November 4th. My last question. There should be models. Chair, we were hearing about models in the United Kingdom. I know there's some in Quebec. There are provinces and other jurisdictions that are providing transparent breakdowns. Should the Government of Canada not adopt that approach to letting figures speak? That is a good question. I believe the government and the public service is familiar with what other jurisdictions do, provinces and other countries. I believe they are selecting their approach with an operational and investment structure or framework. And I think that should be done fairly quickly, but let's wait for November 4th.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to pick up where we left off when the chair so abruptly cut me off last time. We're issuing a record amount of debt this year, as I understand. The last debt management strategy came out early in the summer. I think about $620-odd billion has to be issued this year. Is that your understanding as well? Okay. If the government is saying we will spend less and invest more, in theory, these investments will have a return, of course, because investments do have returns. But they continue to borrow short-term debt instruments. How does that, usually you try to match your assets and liabilities, but if you continue to borrow on the short end of the curve, as they say, but making long-term investments, does that not increase the risk to taxpayers that as interest rates change, taxpayers are, and the government's far more exposed to these sensitivity in interest rates, such that, our debt service costs could actually increase much more quickly if rates were to go up for any reason? I'll note the rates were dropped recently, but the 5-year yield actually increased after the Bank of Canada increased its rates. Is that your understanding as well? We should be looking at the matching of assets and liabilities?
I think duration matching is a pretty fundamental principle of borrowing and investment to make sure that you're not exposed to fluctuations in the financial market, and you need to come up with cash when in fact you can't, because the money's tied up in longer term assets.
Right. Or it's an admission that actually what you're doing is just borrowing to do the operations of government. You don't have to answer that. I'll just leave that there. I read a report earlier this year from the IMF that referenced for every dollar that was spent on interest on the debt, there was a somewhat reduction in spending on social services. Are you aware of that report that came out in the spring, I think? Is that a report that you're familiar with?
Yeah, I'm the report, actually, I think I read the report. I forget it was several months ago, and I read a lot. I forget the precise numbers, but I am familiar with it. But the underlying principle associated with a lot of the basic macroeconomic models is a dollar that the higher your debt and the greater your debt interest costs, it ends up eating up spending in other areas, whether it be social programming or investment or so what have you.
Right. So when you say, when you use the word unsustainable, is that also what you're getting at? That the level of debt that we have and the burden of the service costs of that debt is unsustainable, such that a consequence would be a reduction in social service spending?
A reduction in spending. Again, we don't do policy.
Sure.
We do budgeting, and from a basic budgeting perspective, you have spending and you got revenues, and in a situation where you have a large deficit, and effectively your debt levels are growing at an unsustainable rate, you got to either increase your revenues or you got to decrease your spending.
Right. And so when there were questions asked about increasing debt and deficits 5 and 6 years ago, or saying, after the new administration took over and said they were running some small deficits, debt service costs were about, I think, 7 or 8 cents on the dollar. You're now projecting that goes to 14 cents on the dollar. Some people were laughed out of the room for asking questions about why we should be concerned about this, but here we are. And again, that's before we have any serious economic downturns or even a recession. So would you say that spending is at risk as debt service costs continue to increase? Is that a fair?
That would be conventional macroeconomic policy as practiced by the world.
So are we close to where we were in the mid-90s? Maybe are we closer to where we were in the mid-90s than we were 10 years ago?
The numbers in the mid-90s were far more alarming. This is with an increase now with the federal debt to GDP ratio forecast to increase. If we don't change things, we're going to end up there again. Thankfully.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Rushworth, please, for.
What happened because of the Turd Senior? A lot of Canada doesn't learn about in school. Propaganda. They're not institutions of education, they're institutions of indoctrination. I witnessed this firsthand. I went to a friend's place, the door was open without any word or knowledge, although as a young lad I knew there was stress in the household. You sense it, the depression, you sense the anxiety, the quietness from the adults around. I opened the door, I looked inside. It is as though they had been robbed. I didn't really know what to do. I ran in, screaming, they need help, what's going on? And as I walked by the kitchen table, there was a stack of paperwork with 3 or 4 sets of keys on top. I ran home, told my parents. They sat down and they explained to me that they couldn't afford the interest rates. They couldn't afford to keep paying the house off that they almost owned. They had put most of their life living in that home, raising a family, and all at once, because of Pierre's reckless spending and socialist ideology, he had caused the biggest disaster in Canadian history. The repercussions were felt after he left office. And propaganda kept going on telling how, it's a global thing. At the same time, we witnessed exactly what was going on now. And it was all of the countries that grabbed the reins early and caught on. The people who voted in real, common sense governments to protect themselves walked away scot-free, owned their homes, intergenerational wealth grew. But all those that fell into the same psychotic idealism of socialism and spending Sure, the corporations and the banks, they did great because they took over vast amounts of properties and wealth and resources, while the people lost everything and had to start from scratch. This is what I was warning people about 10 years ago. And every year, it got worse and worse as I was seeing the exact same thing happening. And again, I study history and propaganda, mostly because of what happened to me when I was a child. A lot to do with, again, my ancestry. But it was a combination of the two that really focused me on those in particular items. We're in that same boat, people. It's in the bank's interests to take what they can. It's in the investors' interests to take what they can. And they're going to come, and they're going to take what they think is due to them in their own self-righteous idealism. History is repeating itself.
I imagine that the choices the government will have to make, there will be specific calculations on revenue and expenditure, because otherwise the country can't make ends meet. We talk about risk management. We talk about positions being unsustainable. When I hear we're in trouble, do you think people are aware of the economic situation we're in at the moment and of what's coming? I believe yes. Now I hope so. That is the primary responsibility of our organization: increase financial transparency for members of parliament. And now it's up to you to explain it to Canadians in your riding.
Did you hear what he said? Because the media isn't getting this out there. Propaganda refuses to allow the people to see what's really going on behind the veil. This is beyond insanity, people. And like I stated earlier, he actually went and tried a different way to approach this, to try and get as much noise as he could. He is throwing this out there at the people. The PBO office is screaming at the top of their lungs, we are in fiscal trouble. And it's not just this year, although this is going to catapult us into the point of no return. It's 10 years of propaganda and socialism that have created this mess. He is trying to get the word out. He didn't say anything about media in there, did he? He threw the entire onus onto the representatives. Do you think the Liberals are going to go home and tell their constituents about what they did to our country in the last 10 years? No. Do you think those conservatives are going to have a loud enough speaker to reach through the propaganda wall, the white noise of the bought and paid for media, to awaken Canada to what is going on? No. And after yesterday's episode, seeing how the algorithms and how the censorship works in Canada, do you really think independent media has that ability? No. This is why we keep begging you over and over, and I know we repeat it like a broken record. We need you to like, share, and subscribe. We need to grow. It's the only way we can defeat bad governments. Propaganda is the strong arm of a socialist, communist, fascist, and dictatorship. And we all know how I feel about where we are today. We are in big trouble.
In Appendix C of your report, you have corporate income tax increasing year over year. In recent months, we have had reports of companies moving south of the border and billions of dollars of investment leaving Canada. Was that taken into account in your projections for the corporate income tax?
Thank you for your question. We did take into account recent information, specifically from the Fiscal Monitor for corporate income taxes, as well as in our projection, we've incorporated the nominal GDP decline, which is our broadest tax base, into our corporate profits projection. You do see a decline in 25-26 compared to the level to 24-25, but what we are still observing, is high corporate income taxes coming through the Fiscal Monitor. So perhaps that information that you're referencing is not yet reflected in the Fiscal Monitor. But we have taken into account a decline through the nominal GDP, just to be clear.
Thank you.
See, the corporations have the ability. When taxes get too high and they can't make the profit they need, especially when you can't pay your employees a livable wage, they have the ability to pick up and go to any country and set up shop. How does a citizen do that? We don't have that. Very, very few of us have that ability, that we could actually pick up, pack all of our stuff, pay all of those costs to move to a fresh start, to find a fresh job, to get all of the paperwork in order to be able to work in another country. In the meantime, sitting and paying the debt and the interest on the house you've left behind to start fresh. And what happens when that all starts to crumble? Do you walk away from an entire life? All of your savings tied up in your home, in your investments in that country? We don't have that ability. Corporations do. They are fleeing our country. Mainstream is trying to hide that. It's happening. And it's not just because of Trump. This was going on long before Trump came in, because the taxes were so high. And like I said, it was a combination. It wasn't just that it was cutting into their profits. They couldn't afford to build a product here because they have to pay a living wage to their employees. And if those employees need X amount of dollars to live, your product goes up. And if your product gets taxed on every single aspect of trying to make that widget, and then your corporation gets taxed, there's no profit. And you have no way to compete with other countries.
Are there any concerns that if the government continues on with its current policies, that businesses and investment will continue to leave Canada, leaving the government with less revenue overall?
The simple answer to that question is the status quo approach is not sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Additionally, in your report, you mention a risk of prolonged trade uncertainty, bringing about even worse deficits. Does your report also take into consideration the flow of capital leaving Canada during a prolonged trade dispute and how it will affect the ability for our economy to recover?
Good question.
So that's actually one of our downside, I guess, biggest downside risk. And as Jason says, if the current situation, status quo, is not sustainable.
Okay, and I guess my last question for you would be, if the government continues on its current spending levels, when do you project the budget to be balanced?
Is Is that a trick? Is that a trick question? If you have a very long time. Again, the current status quo is not sustainable. Before, the more immediate pressure for the government, again, looking at the economic forecast, is where we're going to be in years 3 and 4 and 5, and whether the investments that the government plans to make in the economy and capital and infrastructure, and the supports they intend to provide to people to retrain and to move across new industries, whether those are effective and whether they're managed effectively. Yeah.
So under the previous Prime Minister, we were told that budgets would balance themselves. Does it concern you that under this current Prime Minister, we don't even talk about balancing budgets?
The bigger concern as the interim parliamentary budget officer, and given the mandate of our organization to promote fiscal transparency, the bigger concern for us is the current weakness or unevenness in fiscal transparency, because it leaves, notwithstanding our work, it definitely hinders the work of parliamentarians in doing theirs, because there are some very weighty policy decisions that are going to need to be made in a minority parliament over the coming months very quickly. And the more information that is provided to parliamentarians regarding the current fiscal context, all parliamentarians, the easier, like our organization, the easier it will be for anyone to make decisions. More information shared more widely and a higher quality puts everybody further ahead.
Thank you.
I believe that was again a call out. I believe that he purposely worded it that way as a call out. That the media isn't doing their job. They've allowed this government to put brick walls up. They hide and have lost and have laundered and corrupted everything that it is within our system. There are major changes that have to be made. And from my own opinion, let me know how you feel. I'm a firm believer in the Bank of Canada in its original form. This should be step number 1. Start the wheels moving on getting back our money. Give the power back to the people. Then start in reverse and remove this 10 years of incompetence of a child, a socialist child, and all of the people who supported him and clapped like seals, that are all still in power today. Again, because of propaganda. We have a major correction that has to be done. Big trouble. We are in big trouble. I'd like to say I hope you enjoyed today's episode, although that is a lot of bad news. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. If you are, punch the notification bell so you don't miss any future episodes. I'm Alias Tagai. You've been watching the Canadian Citizen Journal. Stay informed.